Welcome back to Workshop Wednesday. If this is your first time joining us, I'm Chelsea Bussemeyer. Thanks for joining me today in my workshop. And today we're going to talk a little bit about facings and how to create your own pattern for a facing. Have you ever sewn a garment where you finished maybe the neckline or the armholes as well with a facing? I love finishing garments with this technique. It's a very clean technique. You don't need any stitching on the outside of the neckline, but even if you haven't used this technique in sewing before, you've probably worn a garment with a facing on the inside that always wanted to roll out or come out, turn around, and we're always like stuffing it back in. So today I'm going to show you how to make your very own facing pattern, but also how to make a pattern for whatever garment with a neck as well as armhole facing together. What I love most about this option for a facing is that they hold each other together so it doesn't roll out at all along the side and kind of coming around the neckline and along the top portion of your armhole. Now, if you do need to attach that facing under the arm just to keep it in and tack down a little bit better, you can definitely do that. Or you can also tack it to any other seams if you have a center back seam, that kind of thing. But sewing the facing together or cutting the facing together, whether or not you have sleeves, is just my favorite method to really keep that facing in place. I also love, like on this green dress behind me, I have these two options here. Now this is a strapless gown, so it doesn't, here, hold it up a little higher, it doesn't have a facing that goes kind of into the straps, but it is finished with a complete lining. And sometimes if you have a color that's a little tricky to find a lining for, or just the way that the edge is, you want to use a little bit of that material from the outside right along the top edge, but you don't want to make the entire lining the same as that outer fabric. It can be a little pricey to line your garment with a fabric rather than a lining, and sometimes you don't need it. So whether you're doing a facing or you want to just do the top edge of your lining in the outer fabric to have a nicer finish, this technique works for both, and it's so easy. Even if the pattern wasn't originally designed to have a facing, you can make your own facing simple and easy anytime just by using the pattern to copy it off. And I'm going to show you how to do that right away. Now this here, I'll show you quick before we get started, is an example of, this is just an asymmetrical gown, so it just has the one-sided strap. But you can see on the inside here, I've created a facing for that strap, for that armhole. It goes underneath and down and all the way around to the other side, attaches to the zipper in the back, and that facing just gives me that nice finished edge without having to do a full lining. Now, I still love doing full lining just because it keeps everything nice and clean and you don't have to finish off any of your raw edges. But depending on the weight you're going for, sometimes if you're doing like a summer dress, you want to keep it really nice and light, you might not want to do a full lining. So let's hop right on over to the table, and I'm so excited to show you this tip because it's just so quick and easy. So let's take a look at this bodice piece here. This is actually for that mother of the bride gown that I'm making with the yellow fabric. If you're part of my Facebook group, then you would have seen me post it. It's this super amazing golden yellow, kind of a mustardy Duchess satin. And if you're not part of my Facebook group, definitely click the link in the description box and join it. And yeah, I'd love to see you in there. And you see here, this is the center back seam. This is my seam allowance for the zipper. And this pattern is a pattern that I designed with the software that I use on my computer and then printed it out. So there's a lot less lines on here than you might see on a commercial pattern, as well as it's just printed on regular paper. Here you can see the arm side, the shoulder, the back of the neckline, and yeah, the center back. And as I said, and to create a facing for this type of a piece, you really have to just decide how low you want to start kind of at the center back. And I'm just going to pick a height here. I think I want to put my label still on the facing, gives it a little bit more structure. So I think I'm going to go just a little bit longer in the back than you really would need to go, and just draw a line. I'm going to start at a right angle here on the back, And then I'm going to dip down somewhat of a curve to go under the arm side here on the side seam. It doesn't need to be as wide or the same distance down. Oftentimes they do get a little bit narrower on the side seam, and I do like a little bit of a curved line. You can get a little bit more of a swoop, less of a swoop, straighter lines. Really doesn't matter the shape, just draw in a shape. Now if I was gonna just make a facing, then this would be the only line I would need at just like the cut edge of the bottom of the facing. But I want to actually add a lining onto my facing. So I want to create the bottom half of the pattern in a pattern piece for the lining and the top half for my facing. So I'm going to just jump it up a little bit here, just a centimeter for my seam allowance. I'm going to do a centimeter seam allowance where I attach the facing and the lining together. And this line, this original line, is going to be my stitch line. And this line is going to be the cut edge for my lining. You can definitely take a ruler and measure it out. I'm just going to do it by eye. I love centimeters seam allowances. It's just like the perfect amount of seam allowance to have a good hold but not have it too thick, especially around curves and stuff like this. So this bottom line is going to be the actual cut line for my facing. Center one is the stitch line and the top one is the cut line for the pattern for my lining. So I'm just going to lay this tissue right on top and then just trace the pattern. So once you've traced the pattern, just one-to-one right across the neckline, the top of the shoulder, the arm side, and down the side seam to the correct line. So for the facing, I need the bottom one. I'm just going to trace this bottom line all the way along. There we go. There we already have the pattern, the new pattern for the facing for the back of this bodice. Then I'm going to just slide this down and see if I still have enough room to create the pattern for my for the lining. Oh, it gets a little tight there. So I'm going to grab a new piece of tissue. Lay it on here. And I'm going to just trace now. Trace this top line is the cut line for the lining portion, and then I know they'll fit just perfectly together. And once I've stitched the facing with the yellow satin together with the lining, I'm going to use a cream lining because that yellow is just really hard to match. Then I know this is going to fit the bodice of this gown just perfectly. There you go. That's all you need to do to create a pattern for both the lining and the facing of a garment. And if I just lay these together with that now 2 centimeters overlapping, they fit just one-to-one perfectly for the transition, and I can finish this neckline with the facing as well as the armhole. Check this out. I just cut it out, stitched it together, and then I've pressed it with the seam allowance down. Even if you're not using something as heavy as a Duchess satin like this yellow, usually the lining is always going to be a little bit softer. So it's usually best to just press both seam allowances down and fold the lining over on itself when attaching a lining to a facing. Sometimes you'll even add some interfacing to the facing part of this kind of combination. If you have a pattern that has steps for adding a facing, oftentimes they'll ask you to add some interfacing. Depending on the weight of the fabric you're using, you may or may not need that interfacing. I haven't added any interfacing here because I don't want it to become too stiff, but I do want to make sure that I have a nice yellow edge right at that transition, just in case someone gets a little bit of a peek underneath the neckline or in one of the armholes when my customer is moving around. And I also wanted to add a couple of kind of technique tips for just installing or stitching the facing to the outer fabric. Now, whenever I add a facing or you cut a facing out, it will always be kind of one-to-one to the outer material. So it's a little bit bigger than my mannequin. I'm just gonna poke it on here so it stays at her shoulder and halfway around her arm. So the top layer of fabric will just come right over top. But when you flip it around, this is just the other side of the facing I'm gonna use for the example today. You wanna make sure that the outer layer, the fabric part of this top is going to be a little bit fuller than the lining or the facing itself. This is a technique that I use whenever I install a lining and whenever I do a facing, is right along the neck seam as well as the arm seam. What I will do is I'll stitch them a little bit offset. So if you can see in my camera right now, how I would pin it together is I would have the facing here sticking out a little bit farther than the fabric on the top where my stitch line goes. So the stitch line would be just a tiny bit in, like 1/8 of an inch or just a couple millimeters farther to the stitch line or the cut edge than the stitch line on the outer material. And the seam allowance would be just a touch wider on that facing, both on the neckline and the armhole. I always finish the armhole first because then I can top stitch it really nice and smooth, and then I'll finish the armhole itself. If you do have a sleeve, you can just stitch both edges together. If you have the sleeveless top like this, then you'll want to have the seam allowance on the inside for sure when you close it up. And when you have just a kind of a set in sleeve that you're adding, you don't need to have the facing go all the way around either. You could just blend it out part way and it'll still hold the neckline nice and flat and smooth, and then have your sleeve added in on the side, but you can also go all the way around. When you offset that seam allowance, getting back to the seam allowance here, when you offset that seam allowance, that'll just give the outer material that little bit more fullness as it rounds over and transitions on that edge to ensure that even when your garment is finished, you're never gonna have a little bit of that facing kind of rolling out. Now, this is super important if it's a different color, not as important if it's tone on tone, but it's still, even like on this red dress, if you look at it, it's much nicer if it's a nice kind of smooth, a rounded edge than it is if you have a little bit of that top stitching kind of rounding back over and through. Were you surprised at how quick and easy it is to create your own facing? It really is just copying the edge of the original pattern and choosing how long you want that facing to go. And like I said at the beginning, I always like to cut both the neckline and the armhole together. It just makes just a nicer finished project and keeps everything in its place. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Workshop Wednesday. I'd love to hear from you if you have a topic that you would like me to cover in one of these episodes, or if you have any questions around facing. So, as always, happy sewing, and I will see you next week on Workshop Wednesday.